In the winter of 1981, two state troopers discovered a farmhouse on the outskirts of town that had remained unopened for 43 years. The door had been nailed shut from the interior. When they finally managed to break through, they came upon two elderly women seated at a kitchen table, their hands folded as if they had been waiting. The women were sisters, both in their 70s. When the troopers inquired why they had been sealed inside since 1938, the sisters exchanged a glance, then turned back to the officers. One of them replied, "We were protecting you." The recordings of their interviews were classified within 72 hours. What you are about to hear has never been released to the public until now. Hello everyone. Before we dive in, be sure to like and subscribe to the channel, and drop a comment telling us where you're from and what time you're watching. This helps YouTube recommend more stories like this one to you. The Hazelridge property had been on the county's radar for decades, yet nobody had ever taken action. It sat 3 miles beyond the town limits, enveloped by thick woods and reachable only by a single dirt road that flooded every spring. Local tax records indicated the land was owned by the Marsh family, specifically two sisters, Dorothy and Evelyn Marsh, born in 1906 and 1909, respectively. But no one in Hazelridge had laid eyes on them since the winter of 1938. The house itself was a 2-story farmhouse, its white paint long since weathered to a dull gray by the elements and neglect. The ground floor windows were boarded over from the inside, and the chimney showed no signs of smoke for as long as anyone could recall. Neighbors, though few in number, occasionally reported seeing lights flickering behind the second-floor windows late at night, but most assumed it was teenagers or drifters using the place as shelter. Everyone believed the Marsh sisters had either passed away or moved on before the Second World War. Then, in January of 1981, a utility worker updating electrical grid maps noticed something peculiar. The house was still drawing power. Not much, just a faint trickle, but consistently month after month. For over 40 years, someone had been paying the bill. When he reported this to the county, they cross-referenced it with tax records and found that the property taxes were also being paid automatically from a bank account established in 1937. The account had never been touched, except for those 2 recurring payments. The county sheriff at the time, a man named Richard Holloway, decided it warranted a welfare check. He dispatched 2 state troopers, Daniel Kovacs and James Brennan, to investigate on January 14, 1981. It was a Wednesday, and the temperature was 9 degrees Fahrenheit. Both men would later request transfers to different counties within 6 months of that visit. Kovacs eventually left law enforcement entirely. When asked why, he would only say that some things you see change the way you sleep at night. Brennan never discussed it publicly, but his daughter later revealed that he started attending church 3 times a week after the Hazelridge call, something he had never done before in his life. When Kovacs and Brennan arrived at the property that January morning, the first thing they noticed was the silence. No birds, no wind rustling through the trees, just an oppressive stillness that Kovacs later described as feeling like the air itself was holding its breath. The front door was solid oak, and it had been nailed shut, not from the outside, as one might expect from an abandoned property, but from the inside. Dozens of nails had been driven through the door into the frame, some of them bent from the force of the hammering. The first-floor windows were similarly sealed, with boards nailed across them from within, overlapping in places as if whoever did it wanted to be absolutely certain no light could get in or out. Brennan radioed back to the station while Kovacs walked the perimeter. The back door was the same. The cellar entrance had been concreted over. Every possible entry point had been methodically sealed, but the electric meter was still spinning. Slowly but steadily. Someone was inside. Someone was using power. After 20 minutes of calling out and receiving no response, Kovacs made the decision to force entry. They used a crowbar on the front door. It took both of them nearly 15 minutes to pry enough nails loose to get it open. The smell hit them first, not decay, which is what they'd expected, but something else. Something organic and dense, like earth and old paper. With a faint chemical undertone they couldn't identify. The interior of the house was almost completely dark. Their flashlights cut through layers of dust that hung in the air like fog. The front hallway was narrow, with wallpaper peeling in long strips. To the left, a sitting room. To the right, what looked like a parlor. Straight ahead, a kitchen. And sitting at the kitchen table, illuminated by a single bare bulb hanging from the ceiling, were two elderly women. They didn't react when the officers entered. Didn't turn their heads, didn't stand. They simply sat there, hands folded on the table in front of them, staring straight ahead at the wall. Both wore long dresses that seemed to belong to another era. High collars, long sleeves. The fabric faded but clean. Their hair was white, pulled back severely from their faces. Kovacs said later that the thing that struck him most wasn't their age or their clothing. It was their eyes. They were perfectly clear, perfectly aware. These were not women who had lost their minds. When he asked if they were Dorothy and Evelyn Marsh, the older one, Dorothy, turned her head slowly to look at him, and she smiled. Not a warm smile, not a relieved smile, but something else entirely. Something that made Kovacs take a step backward despite himself. The official report filed by Kovacs and Brennan that day was 3 pages long. It documented the condition of the house, the state of the two women, and the basic facts of their discovery. But there was another report, one that was filed separately and sealed by the county within 72 hours. That report was 11 pages long. It contained transcripts of the initial conversation that took place in that kitchen. And according to sources who saw it before it was locked away, it contained details that made seasoned law enforcement officers recommend immediate psychiatric evaluation. Not for the sisters, but for anyone who read the full account. The sisters spoke clearly and calmly. They answered questions in complete sentences. They showed no signs of confusion or distress. When Brennan asked how long they'd been in the house, Dorothy said, "Since December of 1938, 43 years. 1 month and 9 days. When he asked why they'd sealed themselves inside, Evelyn, the younger sister, spoke for the first time. Her voice was soft but steady. "We made a promise," she said, "to our father before he died." Kovacs asked what kind of promise would require them to lock themselves away from the world for over 4 decades. Dorothy and Evelyn looked at each other. There was something in that glance, Kovacs said later, that felt like an entire conversation passing between them in silence. Then Dorothy turned back to the officers and said, "We promised to keep it contained." "Keep what contained?" Brennan asked. Dorothy's expression didn't change. "The pattern," she said. As if that explained everything. As if those 2 words should make perfect sense to anyone who heard them. Kovacs, growing frustrated, asked them to clarify. "What pattern? Pattern of what?" The sisters looked at each other again. This time, Evelyn spoke. "Our father discovered it in 1936. He was a mathematics professor at Hazelridge College before it closed. He was working on something he called generational recursion. He believed that certain behaviors, certain traits, certain outcomes could be traced through family lines in predictable ways. Not genetic, something else. Something that moved through blood, but wasn't biological." The officers didn't understand. Neither would most people hearing this secondhand. But what came next? According to the sealed report, was when the conversation took a turn that neither Kovacs nor Brennan could rationalize or dismiss. Dorothy reached into the pocket of her dress and pulled out a small leather journal. She placed it on the table between them. "Everything is in here," she said. "Every generation of our family going back to 1762. My father documented all of it. The pattern repeats every third generation, and when it does, someone dies. Not from accident or illness. They simply stop. Their hearts stop. Their breathing stops. And it always happens on the same day of the year. December 16th. Always the youngest daughter. Always at the age of 33. Brennan, according to his notes, tried to remain professional. He suggested that what the sisters were describing sounded like a tragic series of coincidences, perhaps exacerbated by family superstition or mental illness passed down through generations. But Dorothy shook her head. "That's what our father thought at first," she said, "until he went back and verified every single death. Birth certificates, death certificates, church records, county records, newspaper obituaries. He spent 3 years documenting it all: 1762, 1795, 820, 1861, 1894, 1927, every 33 years. Every December 16th. Every youngest daughter. Dead at 33. No exceptions, no survivors." Kovacs asked the obvious question. If the pattern was real, and if it continued every 33 years, then the next occurrence would have been in 1960. Someone in their family should have died that year. Dorothy's face remained impassive. "My younger cousin, Margaret," she said. "December 16th, 1960. She was 33 years old. They found her in her apartment in Philadelphia. No signs of violence. No drugs or alcohol in her system. The coroner ruled it cardiac arrest, but she had no history of heart problems. She was healthy. She went to bed on the 15th and never woke up." Evelyn leaned forward slightly, her hands still folded on the table. "But Margaret wasn't supposed to be the youngest daughter," she said quietly. "I was." The room went silent. Brennan later said he could hear his own heartbeat in his ears. Evelyn continued, her voice steady but carrying a weight that seemed to press down on everything around her. "I was born in 1909. In 1937, I would have been 28 years old. By 1960, I would have been 51. But the pattern doesn't care about age. When the cycle comes, it cares about position in the family line. I was the youngest daughter of my generation. December 16th, 1960. That was my death day. My father knew it. He'd calculated it. He'd tried everything to stop it. Moved us to different cities. Changed our names. Even tried to have the family line legally dissolved. Nothing worked. The pattern didn't care about documents or distance. So, what did they do?" Kovacs asked. How did Evelyn survive if the pattern was unbreakable? Dorothy answered this time, her voice dropping lower, as if she were sharing a secret that should never be spoken aloud. "Our father found a loophole," she said. "If the youngest daughter removed herself from the world entirely, if she ceased to exist in any public record, any social connection, any interaction with the outside, the pattern couldn't find her. It needs witnesses. It needs the person to be part of the world." So, in December of 1938, when Evelyn turned 29, we sealed ourselves in this house. We cut off all contact with everyone. No visitors, no letters, no phone calls. We lived on preserves and canned goods we'd stockpiled. We paid our bills automatically, so no one would come looking, and we waited, 22 years. That's how long the sisters stayed sealed in that house, waiting for December 16th, 1960 to pass. Evelyn would have been 51 by then, 18 years past the age of 33 that the pattern demanded. According to the journal their father left behind, once a woman passed beyond the target age, she was safe. The pattern would move on, searching for the next youngest daughter in the next generation. But here's what made Kovacs and Brennan's blood run cold when they heard it. The sisters didn't unseal the house in 1960. They didn't unseal it in 1965 or 70 or 75. They stayed locked inside for 43 years. When Brennan asked why they remained after Evelyn was safe, Dorothy looked at him with those clear, aware eyes, and said something that appeared in the sealed report, but was never explained. Because we heard it knocking. The officers asked what she meant. Dorothy's hands tightened slightly on the table, the only sign of emotion she'd shown since they arrived. 3 months after December 16th, 1960, she said, we started hearing something at the door, at night, usually between 200 and 400 in the morning. A knocking, slow and deliberate. 5 knocks, always 5, with exactly 10 seconds between each one. We never answered, we never looked, but it kept coming back. Every December 16th after that, every year 1961, 63, year after year, the knocking would last for 3 hours, then stop. And every year it got louder. Evelyn's voice was barely a whisper now. Last year it wasn't just at the door. It was at the windows, all of them. At the same time, as if something was circling the house, testing every sealed entrance, looking for a way in. If you're still watching, you're already braver than most. Tell us in the comments. What would you have done if this was your bloodline? The journal Dorothy gave to the officers was later examined by 3 separate psychiatrists and 2 historians. The handwriting was consistent throughout, belonging to their father, Professor Martin Marsh. The dates were accurate. The death records he'd referenced were verified. Every single one checked out, 1762 through 1927. Every entry was documented in public records exactly as he'd written. But the journal contained something that was noted in the sealed report, but never fully detailed. The last 30 pages were written in a different ink, not by the father, but by Dorothy. She'd continued his work, documenting something she called the progression. Day-by-day entries, clinical and precise, describing how the knocking had changed over the decades, how it had evolved. In 1960, it was faint, almost tentative. By 1970, it was forceful enough to rattle the door in its frame. By 1980, she wrote, they could feel the vibrations through the floor. And on December 16, 1980, just 1 month before the officers found them, Dorothy had written only 1 line. It spoke our names. The officers didn't know what to do with any of this. Their job was to check on 2 elderly women who'd been reported as potentially missing or deceased. What they found instead was something that didn't fit into any category their training had prepared them for. The sisters were physically healthy, remarkably so for their age and circumstances. They were coherent, articulate, and showed no signs of psychosis or delusion. The house, despite its sealed state, was relatively clean. The sisters had maintained a routine, sleeping in shifts. One always awake, always listening. They'd lived on canned goods and dried stores, rationing carefully. They'd read by candlelight to save electricity. They'd even maintained a small notebook of daily observations, noting weather patterns they could hear but not see. Tracking time with mechanical precision. Kovacs and Brennan made the decision to remove the sisters from the property. It wasn't a rescue, exactly. The women didn't want to leave. Dorothy insisted multiple times that leaving was dangerous. That breaking the seal was exactly what wanted, that they'd held it at bay for over 4 decades. And now the officers were undoing everything. But protocol demanded they be taken for medical and psychiatric evaluation. The ambulance arrived around 300 in the afternoon. The sisters were escorted out of the house they hadn't left since Franklin Roosevelt was president. Evelyn wept quietly as they crossed the threshold. Dorothy remained silent, her face unreadable. As they placed her in the ambulance, she turned to Kovacs and said something that he included in his personal notes, but not in the official report. "You've let it out now," she told him. "It knows there's a next generation. It'll find them faster than it found us. The sisters were taken to Hazelridge General Hospital, where they remained under observation for 6 days. Doctors found them malnourished but otherwise healthy. Their mental evaluations were inconclusive. They showed no signs of schizophrenia, no dissociative disorders, no evidence of shared psychosis. They simply maintained, calmly and consistently, that everything they'd said was true. On January 20th, 1981, both sisters were released into the care of a distant relative, a nephew named Thomas Marsh, who lived in Ohio. They left Pennsylvania that same day. The house was boarded up by the county and marked for eventual demolition. The leather journal and all documentation related to the case were sealed by court order. The official reason given was to protect the privacy of the Marsh family. But 3 people who were present during the sealing process later said, off the record, that the real reason was something else entirely. The judge who ordered it sealed had read the full report, all 11 pages, and when he finished, he'd closed the folder, looked at the county prosecutor, and said, "No one else reads this. No one talks about this. We bury it, and we forget we ever saw it." Dorothy Marsh died on March 3, 1982, 14 months after leaving the Hazelridge house. She was 76 years old. The death certificate listed natural causes. Evelyn lived another 9 years, passing away in 1991 at the age of 82. She spent those years in a care facility in Cleveland, quiet and cooperative, never speaking about what had happened in Pennsylvania. When she died, she left behind a single request in her will, that she be cremated and her ashes scattered in a river, not buried in the family plot. The nephew, Thomas Marsh, honored the request. He also inherited what remained of the family documents, including copies of his great-uncle's research that had been stored in a safety deposit box. Thomas read through everything once, then burned it all in his backyard. When asked why by his wife, he told her he didn't want his daughters to ever see it. But here's what Thomas didn't know, what couldn't have been predicted. The pattern, if it was real, operated on a 33-year cycle. 1960 was the last occurrence, which meant the next one would be 1993. Thomas Marsh had 2 daughters, Sarah, born in 1968, and Rebecca, born in 1971. Rebecca was the youngest. On December 16, 1993, Rebecca Marsh was 22 years old, living in an apartment in Pittsburgh, working as a paralegal. She was not 33. She didn't match the pattern. But at 2:47 in the morning, her roommate woke up to use the bathroom and found Rebecca standing in the kitchen staring at the door. When the roommate asked if she was okay, Rebecca turned around slowly. Her eyes were open but unfocused. She said, in a voice her roommate later described as not quite her own, "Someone's knocking. Can't you hear it?" There was no knocking. The roommate tried to guide Rebecca back to bed, but Rebecca wouldn't move. She just stood there staring at the door, listening to something no one else could hear. Rebecca Marsh died 6 weeks later on January 28, 1994. The official cause of death was listed as suicide. She'd stopped eating, stopped sleeping, and eventually stopped responding to anyone around her. Her family had her committed to a psychiatric facility, but nothing helped. She would sit for hours motionless, staring at walls or doors or windows, as if watching something move on the other side. In her final days, she spoke only once to a nurse who was checking her vitals. The nurse documented it in her notes, though she didn't understand what it meant. Rebecca looked directly at her and whispered, "It found me anyway. It always finds us. You can't hide from your blood." 24 hours later, her heart simply stopped. She was 23 years old, not 33. The pattern had changed. The Hazelridge house was demolished in 2003. The land was sold to a development company, but remains undeveloped to this day. Local contractors who've been approached about building there have consistently declined, citing issues with permits or soil stability, though county records show no such problems. The sealed documents from 1981 remain sealed. Requests to access them under Freedom of Information laws have been denied 4 times. The official reason is always the same: privacy concerns for surviving family members. But there are no surviving family members. The Marsh line, as far as public records show, ended with Rebecca. Thomas Marsh died in 2008. His other daughter, Sarah, never married and never had children. She lives alone in Oregon now under a different last name. When contacted by researchers interested in her family history, she has declined every single time. She did, however, respond once in a brief email that simply said, "Some stories shouldn't be told. Some things should stay buried. Please don't contact me again." The officers who found the sisters are both gone now. Kovacs died in 2006 and Brennan in 2011. Neither ever spoke publicly about what happened in that house, but Brennan's daughter, in an interview years later, shared something her father told her shortly before he died. He said he'd gone back to the Hazelridge property once alone in 1982, about a year after they'd removed the sisters. The house was still standing then, boarded and empty. He didn't go inside. He just stood in the yard looking at it in the fading light. And as the sun went down, he said he heard it. 5 knocks, slow and deliberate, 10 seconds between each one, coming from inside the house that no one had entered in over a year. He got back in his car and never returned. When his daughter asked him if he believed what the sisters had said, if he thought the pattern was real, he looked at her for a long time before answering. Then he said something she's never forgotten. "I don't know if it's real, but I know that something was in that house with them. And I know it's still looking." That's the story of the Hazelridge sisters. 2 women who locked themselves away from the world for 43 years to escape something that moved through their bloodline like a shadow. Whether you believe in patterns or curses or generational trauma that takes physical form, the facts remain. The deaths happened. The dates align. And somewhere in a sealed government file, there are 11 pages that someone decided the public should never see. Maybe they were right. Maybe some secrets are better left buried. Or maybe, just maybe, the only thing worse than knowing is not knowing what's been passed down through your own blood, waiting for its turn to knock on your door. Thanks for watching.